Good afternoon. This is Ernesto Burden. I'm the publisher of Military and Aerospace Electronics, and I am here with John Keller, our editor-in-chief, for this week's Rapid Fire. Welcome, John.
How are you?
I'm not so bad. Back from, as you are, AUVSI last week, which was a fascinating time.
A lot of very interesting stuff down there. A lot of interesting trends, too.
Yeah, what would you say your top takeaway trend was?
You know, my top takeaway, and I actually did a video blog on it this past week. It seems like, you know, you go out and you look over that vast exhibit for AUVSI, and where in years past they've had a lot of heavy iron there. You know, Global Hawks, Predators, you know, the big military UAVs. Now it seems the emphasis is really shifting toward the smaller UAVs, and it seems like the big emphasis is not on military applications, but on relatively new applications like you know, agriculture, pipeline inspection, even hobbyists. People want to spy on their next door neighbors. So wouldn't surprise me if, at least in some neighborhoods, we start to hear spontaneous shotgun fire.
Yeah. Yes, as they apply for their hunting permits for unmanned aerial vehicles.
Well, yeah, I think, didn't we have a discussion on, you know, what would be, you know, a limit on unmanned aerial vehicles, and what do you have to do to fill your UAV tag?
Exactly. You know, we saw a lot of UUVs there too. Is that, in your opinion, is that a growing trend, or is that just was it more noticeable to me because I was looking at all the big iron last year?
Well, you know, I think it is. I think UUVs are growing. Unmanned underwater vehicles. These are, you know, those torpedo-shaped submersibles that can operate, you know, completely autonomously or you know, with some human intervention. I think that they're growing at a much shallower trajectory than unmanned aerial vehicles have. But I think that they're growing in importance because you know, once you get into an ocean environment, particularly a very deep ocean environment, it's very much like space. It's so inhospitable. But you know, you've got offshore oil exploration that, you know, needs to have a lot of surveillance underwater, needs to have capability for deep repair, things like that. And anytime you send a human diver down, you're putting that person at risk. So I think that unmanned submersibles for military as well as for civil industrial applications is going to grow. And I think that also with the unmanned underwater vehicles, you're going to see very interesting trends in terms of designing of great big, you know, unmanned motherships that would be able to deploy a variety of unmanned underwater vehicles. And in fact, you know, it was there at AUVSI in Orlando last week that I first started hearing some talk about an unmanned anti-submarine warfare system that essentially would consist of a fairly sizable unmanned mothership that would be able to deploy unmanned underwater vehicles with very sophisticated sonars that would go out and be able to cover large areas of the ocean and with ping active sonar, and would be able to, you know, tell, are there any submarines lurking out there? And it might be a future way to, you know, clear vast areas of the ocean for carrier battle groups, things like that.
Okay, well, it actually, not that we planned it this way, but this vein of the conversation leads us directly into one of the three stories that you've identified this week as a critical story on military and aerospace electronics, and that is the Bluefin-21 UUV set this week to make another deep dive in effort to locate the missing Malaysia 370 flight. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that headline was written last week, so this week is actually last week. But I think that the folks at Bluefin, I have not heard back. Now they are having that Bluefin-21. It's been it's been recertified and gone through some upgrades that are enabling it to dive below what had been its certified deepest depth of about 15,000 feet. That Bluefin-21 is out there in the Indian Ocean, about 1,000 miles west of Australia, and it's diving deeper than 15,000 feet. It goes down to depth. It takes it about 2 hours to get down there, 2 hours to get back up. But once it gets down there, it uses its imaging sonar, and it essentially does a lawnmower type of pattern in efforts to look for it. Now, if that plane had actually been found, I think that it would be nonstop on CNN that they'd actually found it, and I haven't heard a word. So I'm thinking that it probably hasn't happened yet. But you know that environment where that Bluefin-21 is operating really is a lot like space, and that's one of the few highly reliable unmanned underwater vehicles that can operate in super harsh conditions like that.
Well, for those who go onto the site and want to read that story, it's worth noting that that you do have a good conversation with the CEO from Bluefin about the search and the way that underwater vehicle is participating in it.
Oh yeah, well that UUV is really something, and that accompanying video there really will show people what it looks like, and so it's a good place to go.
Great. Second story: Air Force researchers choose Matrix for CERFER program to track targets amid RF jamming.
Yeah, one of the reasons I picked that was just for the name. I particularly like that program called CERFER.
Yeah.
But I wrote a blog about this. I think that later this week, it's indicative of. I think that some of the top leaders in the Pentagon are starting to come around to the notion that we're not in future conflicts. They're not going to be a cakewalk against an technologically inferior enemy anymore. So they're starting to give a lot of thought about how do we go into so-called contested space, places that have sophisticated electronic warfare jamming, sophisticated fighter cover, things like that. Places where you have a determined adversary on technological parity or close to it, with the United States and its allies, and be able to go into those areas and still be able to use radar, still be able to use communications, things like that. So I'm starting to see more programs like this CERFER program of just what are the technologies we need to develop to go into contested space and prevail. So it's one of those areas. Another one is the Congress has been voicing some concerns about that Navy U-class armed unmanned aerial vehicle that's going to operate off carriers. That because of time and cost constraints, I understand some of the requirements for that unmanned aircraft have kind of been watered down, and what we have now is a requirement for an unmanned aerial vehicle that doesn't have too much armament. And can go out and do surveillance and reconnaissance. And the admirals, I understand, are saying, no, well, wait a minute. That's not what we really need out there with the carrier battle group. We need an unmanned aircraft with plenty of armament that could go, that can bomb targets, and also can go into contested airspace. And defend itself, against missiles and be able to operate in jamming and things like that. So the whole idea, and I think that CERFER program really is one strong indication, is that people in the Pentagon are giving a lot more thought to, contested battle space than they used to.
Okay. Our next story. Army to build blast and EMP-proof launch control building for Alaska-based missile defense. What's the impetus for this development?
Well, I thought it was pretty interesting as I was looking through the requirements. I was thinking, boy, we're headed back to the Cold War days. It was kind of echoes of the Cheyenne Mountain complex out there outside of Colorado Springs. They want to have a blast hardened building that's hardened against electromagnetic pulse. It's and this would be a launch control center for the anti-ballistic missile system that's based in Alaska. That essentially, they call that, it's located on the Great Circle. The intent would be that that would be able to defend against incoming ballistic missiles launched from places like North Korea, say. And they are really coming up with a super hardened building, and I just haven't seen this kind of thing before. Again, it's another indication of military people starting to give more thought to how do we operate and prevail against a determined adversary in contested space.
Now, when you're talking about an EMP attack, what what are the shapes that that attack takes? Relative or not relative to a nuclear attack?
Well, when we're talking EMP, as often as not, or perhaps more often than not, you're really talking about a nuclear attack. When you have a nuclear explosion, you have several different components. Among them is blast, another is heat and radiation, and another is electromagnetic pulse. And it's the EMP portion of that that creates tremendous power surges, and especially in today's era of miniaturized high-performance electronics, these things are extremely susceptible to that kind of power surge. Anything electronic, from toasters to personal computers to cell phones, most likely in an EMP would be destroyed, just essentially fried. Up there in Alaska, where they want to have a highly survivable launch control center, they're doing what they need to do to shield the electronics there from EMP. Now, we're hearing a lot about EMP in the news lately. The fact is that if you had a fairly sizable EMP type weapon, be it just EMP or a nuclear weapon, that was able to be exploded in close Earth orbit above, say, Kansas City, that means lights out in the lower 48 for as long as a year, maybe even longer. And people might think of that as an inconvenience, but if you had the power grid in this country go out for as long as a year, you could have as much as 70% of the population would not survive. We would basically be back to about the year 1810 as far as technology is concerned. So the military is very concerned about EMP. I think people in Congress are starting to be more and more concerned about EMP and the commercial power grids. So it's something that we're going to be reading more about.
Okay, well, on that jovial note, on that upbeat and positive tone, we'll call that rapid fire for the week. Thank you very much, John, and thank you everybody for watching. You can read any of the stories that John is referencing here by going to militaryaerospace.com. And John, see you next week.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.